Well, I talked about hell in my last video, and I want to talk a little bit more about it in this video. And specifically, I want to reflect a little bit on a very popular uh, response to the moral problem with hell. And that's the idea that hell is a self-imposed exile, that it's not God torturing us in hell. Rather, it's the fact that we sort of torture ourselves, we inflict misery on ourselves. And this idea is supposed to offer some significant degree of amelioration or sort of a softening of the image of hell, a reduction of the moral problem that is presented by the doctrine. So the idea that it's not that God makes you suffer forever, it's that you make yourself suffer. Now, of course, you may know that this view is very well stated by C.S. Lewis in a couple quotes. So in The Great Divorce, when the character of George MacDonald is talking, he says, "There are only two kinds of people, those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done." Nice little Lewisian phrase there. So either we choose to submit to God or we choose not to submit to God. And if it's the latter, then you end up in hell and you have self-imposed suffering forever. Also in The Problem of Pain, which I never tire of telling people is a wonderful little theodicy written in the middle of the 20th century and really was, in some key ways, was quite advanced for its time, I guess I'll put it that way, because it was talking about things, in particular natural evil, and really wrestling with the problem of hell and eternal suffering in a way that many other theodicies of the time simply were not. And of course, it has all the other typical Lewisian qualities to it. In one point in The Problem of Pain, Lewis says, the gates of hell are locked on the inside. So again, you have this idea that, well, hell is not as bad as we thought. The moral problem presented by it is not as bad as we thought because people choose it for themselves. It is a self-imposed exile. Now, I agree on the face of it. Certainly, there's some greater appeal to that position, and there's also some scriptural warrant for it. One could certainly get that message out of a passage like Romans 1, where Paul describes God as turning people over to their own sinful desires and impulses and self-destructive nature, and we can just see hell as the ultimate manifestation of God doing that for eternity. But there are also significant problems with this idea of hell as a self-imposed exile, and I want to reflect here in particular. I mean, we could talk about the scriptural problems, because the scriptural problems would be the ones that describe God as being the active agent of judgment. So he's the one who separates the sheep from the goats, Matthew 25, or he's the one who throws people into this image of a lake of fire, like the one burning behind me, Revelation 20. Or he's the one, again, Revelation 14, who visits out his judgment upon people. He's the active agent of judgment in multiple passages. So it's very difficult in those passages to see the idea of self-imposed exile as being the primary motif. Having said that, the thing I want to focus on is really the moral issue, the idea that this somehow weakens the moral offense. And again, I concede maybe to some degree it does. I just want to argue the more modest thesis that the moral advantage of a self-imposed torture is not quite as much as people thought it was. So why think that? Well, let me give you, first of all, an example from my high school. So I knew a young lady at my high school, and we'll just call her Jan, not her real name. And we were at a party once, and I remember this, I'll never forget it, walking into the kitchen and seeing Jan having a kitchen knife and cutting herself in the arm. That was my first encounter with what are sometimes called cutters, people who have severe psychological and moral stressors or not moral stressors, but psychological and emotional stressors in their life. And one way that they try to release the pain is through self-imposed pain, inflicting cutting on themselves, because it provides a temporary release. And over the years, I've occasionally encountered other people who I discovered at one point or another that they too were cutters. Now, when we walked into the kitchen and we discovered at this party that Jan was cutting herself, our response was not to say, well, you know, she's doing a self-imposed cutting, so she can just leave her to it. She can impose pain and misery on herself. Rather, we physically removed the implement from her hands. We stopped her from imposing further misery upon herself. Now, if you think about hell, hell, of course, is the ultimate act of self-imposed misery. And why, one would think, would it make sense simply because it is self-imposed that the rest of us are going to stand by and do nothing while this person imposes this kind of pain and misery upon themselves? Now, to explore this a little further, I want to, here it is. I want to show a clip, and this is from a promotion from Frontline Documentaries. Some years ago, they did, probably around 7, 8 years ago, they did a documentary, What Life is Really Like in Solitary Confinement.
Tonight on Frontline,
it's like being buried alive.
This place is like an insane asylum. Thoughts of suicide.
So I'm just going to give a little bit of my own commentary here. So they're talking about showing all these guys in solitary confinement. And the one thing that they all begin to do is they go into severe psychological spirals. They begin to impose suffering upon themselves. They find ways to cut themselves. You're going to see in a moment, just punching the wall, the plexiglass. That guy has a razor blade. They begin to cut themselves within solitary. They smear blood and feces on the walls. You're going to see that in a second here, right there. He's smearing his own blood on the plexiglass. The idea is that increasingly there's a recognition that simply throwing someone into the hole and leaving them to rot is not a morally justifiable way to deal with proper jurisprudence. And the idea then is we're beginning to evolve, right? And to have a more, I think, a healthier understanding of what punishment should look like in the West, that you don't simply turn people over to their misery. So, I mean, of course, if I remember back in 30 some years ago when I was visiting England, and we went to Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. And there's this famous part of the Wax Museum, which sadly is no longer there, called the Medieval Torture Chamber. And they showed how, through these graphic reconstructions, how English Western law was predicated on this idea that you could torture people throughout the medieval period and inflict horrible tortures on people, like the Iron Maiden or the Pear of Anguish. You don't want to know what the Pear of Anguish is, believe me. You know, the rack, stretching people out and torturing them. And we recognize that that is barbaric, that that's just immoral way to behave and to treat another human being, another sentient life form. So then we evolved, and we had this more humane idea. And the more humane idea is not that you actively torture people, but that you allow them to actively torture themselves. And that's what solitary confinement was. You kind of throw people into the jail cell, lock the door, and let them cut themselves and smear their blood and feces on the wall and punch the plexiglass until they break their hand and gradually go into the spiral of self-destructive despair. We are increasingly now recognizing, no, solitary confinement, that's not the way you deal with people. Hell, on this idea of C.S. Lewis, is the ultimate form of self-imposed exile and of self-imposed misery. And if we are increasingly recognizing that it is an inhumane way for human beings to interact with one another, then the question inevitably arises, why would we think that that is the way that God would choose to deal with us? And that's simply stated my objection, the moral objection to self-imposed misery or exile.